Good afternoon, good morning. My name is Megan Stiefel. Welcome to today's webinar. I am the Executive Director of the Americas for the Global Cyber Alliance, and we are delighted to have everyone here today. We are particularly honored to have several members, several former elections officials as our panelists today, including two former secretaries of state. So we're delighted to have you and thank you for participating. Before we begin today's session, we will have some housekeeping announcements. The first is that if you look to the right on your control panel, you will have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenters by typing your question in the panel. You can send in your questions at any time, and we will be holding these until the end of each session, each panel. We will also follow up after the webinar if you have any questions that we are not able to respond to. Today's webinar is being recorded, so please note that if you continue on the webinar, you are consenting to the recording. Change slides. Great, so I wanted to run through quickly our agenda today. As I mentioned who I am, we will have a brief introduction from Craig Newmark, the founder of Craig Newmark Philanthropies. As some of you may know, the work that Global Cyber Alliance conducts in this space, primarily through our Toolkit for Election Security, is graciously supported by a grant from the Craig Newmark Philanthropies. So we will have an introduction from Craig, and then we will have two panels. The first will touch on how it is that we've reached and come to this point here in 2020. There's a lot of guidance out there. Our panelists will talk about the relevance and applicability of particular guidance to a particular issue area. We will then have some time for questions and answers and a few brief polling questions in between the two panels. And you will see those polling questions come up in your control panel. We'll then turn to our second panel regarding specific actions that can be taken now between now and November to really emphasize and improve the security of elections. Also thinking about specific issues that the voters and the press could be mindful of. We do have a broad audience today. We're delighted that a number of elections officials have joined, but also recognize that we have members of civil society, partners of the Global Cyber Alliance and other organizations online, as well as members of the media. So with that brief introduction, I wanted to turn it over to an introductory remarks from one of our supporters, Craig Newmark.
A long time ago in high school, I had a really good U.S. history and civics class. From there, I learned that our country, and really democracy everywhere, depends on a lot of things, particularly on fair elections. Well, right now, our elections are under attack by our foreign adversaries and others. Seriously, the only way we can defend our country is to all participate. This is a serious all hands on deck situation. The solution involves better cybersecurity practices for everyone, but in particular for the people who are running our elections throughout the whole country. Global Cyber Alliance, seriously speaking, they lead the way. GCA provides election officials with the tools that they need to secure their work. That's over 10,000 election officials and organizations throughout America. The GCA Toolkit consists of carefully selected tools from the CIS Handbook for Elections Infrastructure Security. Reminding you, our defense is for real and all hands on deck situation. Everyone that can help, however they can, should. Everyone should pitch in. Good cybersecurity begins at work and home. Do what you can to protect systems, but beyond that, I'd really appreciate if you could help the Global Cyber Alliance and help election officials secure American voter systems. They need your contributions, whatever you can do, and they need your active participation. Remember, it's all hands on deck. Our country relies on all of us.
Thank you, Craig, for the introduction and for the support to the toolkit and the community at large. We'll now turn to our first panel, which will be moderated by Mr. Trey Grayson, former Secretary of State for the state of Kentucky and currently a partner at Frost, Brown & Todd. Thank you, Trey and panelists.
Thanks, Megan, and thanks to everybody for joining in today. We have got a great first panel to kick off the conversation. Let me do some quick introductions. You all are watching on a webinar, so you can Google more information about these three panelists if you want to learn more. So I'm just going to give the very top line introduction. Ben Spear is the director of the Elections Infrastructure Information Sharing and Analysis Center at the Center for Internet Security. He is coordinating the nationwide deployment of elections-focused cyber defense suite. Liz Howard is the Council for Democracy Programs at NYU's Brennan Center for Justice. She's the focus also on election security, previously served as the Deputy Commissioner for the Virginia Department of Elections. And then Matt Masterson, the Cybersecurity Advisor, Senior Cybersecurity Advisor, got to make sure you're not junior, Senior Cybersecurity Advisor, Matt, for the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Prior to this role, he served as a commissioner with the Elections Assistance Commission and filled various roles in the Ohio's Secretary of State's office, including Deputy Elections Director and Chief Information Officer. The big topic that we've been asked to kick off a conversation about in part one is, how are we improving our election cybersecurity and how did we get here? We're not going to rehash what happened in 2016. If you're watching this, you know in general what happened in 2016. What we want to talk about is what's happened since. And since then, there's been a lot of guidance and policy recommendations developed by several organizations, including some of the organizations represented by the folks on this webinar. And so what we wanted to do in this first part of the conversation was just to ask each of the three of them to talk about the various types of guidance that they're familiar with, both the ones that their organizations have released as well as others, just so we can have a good overview of that guidance. So I'm going to start with Liz. So Liz, why don't you get us started on this topic? So thanks.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Trey. It is such a pleasure to join you today, and thank you so much to the Global Cyber Alliance for organizing today's event and for everything that you do for election officials. I think the first and most important thing that I'm going to say today is thank you so much to our election officials who are out there fighting to conduct and administer free, fair, and secure elections in some of the most challenging circumstances I've ever seen. As we know, election administration has become increasingly complex over the past several years, and our election officials are subject to higher and higher technical expectations, among others. And with the pandemic and spiraling government revenues, our election officials are being asked to do even more with even less. In good news, although our election officials are facing increasing complexity and increasing threats, there are many measures that can be implemented between now and November that are simple and that can protect our systems come what may between now and November. So I'm just going to quickly give a brief overview of a couple of the recommendations that are included in our report, Preparing for Cyber Attacks and Equipment Failures in a Pandemic. And these recommendations work in conjunction with and complement the recommendations in Global Cyber Alliance's toolkit that you heard Craig Newmark reference earlier. And I hope you get a chance to check out these resources. I think there's a lot of great information. So first, talking about a couple of recommendations that can help you beef up the capacity, resiliency, and security of your online tools that voters are increasingly using due to the pandemic to communicate with their election officials. So such as online voter registration, online absentee ballot tools, and email systems. And I'll note, for better or worse, many of the recommendations in this report come from somewhat painful lessons that I learned as an election official in Virginia. So for instance, and I know Trey mentioned that we weren't going to rehash 2016, but I just can't help but mention on the deadline to register to vote in the last presidential election, our voter registration tool failed. So we, of course, had a ton of very upset potential registrants, a very unhappy governor, and of course, litigation followed. So we can talk about a couple of the measures that we quickly implemented and we think are best practices too. So first, we got the services of a content delivery network. So they are able to monitor the traffic and rebalance it and protect your systems against DDoS attacks and others. Another important measure that we implemented pretty quickly again was to implement the functionality that would redirect individuals that were trying to register and that couldn't get through to basically a static page that had a PDF of the online voter registration form or the form that they were working to fill out, that they were trying to fill out online. So next, I want to talk about the recommendations in those states where voters are allowed to submit online absentee ballot applications via email. As we've seen absentee voting just explode across the country, that has been accompanied by a significant increase in email traffic of those forms. And the reality is there were a lot of election officials that had email systems that were just not prepared for this significant spike. Basic recommendation is for election officials to assess their email server capacity now and determine whether or not they need to increase that capacity. They can also identify and create a designated email address for election officials to send in, for voters to send in the absentee ballot applications or other forms that they're allowed to. And obviously they need to continually check their junk mail filters to make sure that appropriate emails are getting through and that the voters can connect with you. So next, I'll quickly talk about some recommendations for making your in-person voting systems more resilient. So for those voters in jurisdictions where they rely primarily on paper ballot voting systems, which includes all the election officials in all but 8 states, we recommend that those jurisdictions go ahead and order enough paper ballots for 120% turnout. We've all seen the press reports about the concerning decreases in voter registration numbers, and we just don't know what that means. But it could mean that there's going to be a significant spike in voter registrations at or near the voter registration deadline, which is a huge challenge for officials because they have to order their paper ballots long before those voter registration deadlines. And then separately, in jurisdictions where they rely primarily on DREs, so the direct reporting electronic machines, often called the touch screens, or the ballot marking devices as their primary voting system, we recommend that those officials go ahead and order enough paper ballots that would allow voting to continue for approximately 2 to 3 hours of peak voting. And this is normally going to be about enough paper ballots for approximately 35% of your registered voters. And one more quick recommendation has to do with provisional ballot materials, kind of informal reports that we're receiving from a couple of states, including Pennsylvania and Georgia, indicate that there has been a spike in the number of voters that need to vote provisional. And so we think every election official should be on notice that this is a potential issue for November. And I think just quickly again in closing, I think all of us today, you'll hear from Ben and Matt in just a minute and in the second panel soon, but I think all of us completely agree that we are here to support our election officials and to work with you. And just to echo again what Craig Newmark said, we are all in this together. So I hope that you call, email, or tweet if you have any questions, and if we can't answer them, we will work to find someone who can. Thank you.
Thanks, Liz. And I want to reiterate what she said at the end. Liz is an awesome resource. If she doesn't know the answer, she knows somebody who does know the answer and can connect you immediately. So please take her up on that offer. Next up, Ben Spear from EI-ISAC. Tell us your take on some of this. What have we been working on since 2016 to try to make sure that we don't see a repeat?
Yeah, I mean, of course, Liz hit a lot of good points, and I think that there's been a lot of work that's been done to sort of address what are the, where were the gaps and where can we fill them in. And I think, there's a lot of ways that CIS has come in to Cyber Security to sort of take a role to assist in that. You know, most folks know us through in the elections community through the ISAC initially, and the multi-state ISAC, which then evolved to also include the elections infrastructure ISAC, which I oversee through the support of CISA and Matt's team and the folks over there through federal funding. But then there's also the other part in terms of the best practices that we've developed and deployed through our security best practice team. And so it's really been a two-pronged approach where CIS is not just taking this from a perspective of, you know, how can we support in our role as a CISA ISAC to support the SLTT community, but also how can we on our own as CIS help to contribute and bring more to that community. And so within the ISAC itself, you know, we've, since starting in 2018, went from, you know, 2 secretaries of state that had been members of the MS-ISAC for some time to, at the start of the ISAC, about 50 secretaries and local election offices joining to now today we have all 50 states, DC, 3 territories, 2,450 local election offices. And it's really a testament to the engagement from the elections community on the issue of security. As we look to that, we're bringing forth network monitoring, we're bringing forth other tools in terms of incident response and support. We're bringing that cybersecurity education and awareness to the elections community. And from what we've seen so far, the response has been positive in terms of folks picking up on what we're bringing to the table, and then trying to implement it or trying to figure out ways that we can continue to collaborate on those issues. From there, you jump to the CIS side in terms of the best practices, where first everything we've done and everything the way that sort of CIS is modeled off of is this idea of this consensus-based collaborative space. And so while we are a team that has a number of folks that are focused in cybersecurity, we didn't think it was appropriate for us to just come in and say, well, this is how you should secure elections because we're these great big cybersecurity experts. What we did in developing a lot of those is brought in a lot of different election officials, folks like Liz, folks like Matt, folks, various secretaries and their IT staffs and clerks and their IT staff to try to have a conversation, and a number of the national associations as well, such as the National Association of Secretary of State, the National Association of State Election Directors. And so what we did there is sort of have that conversation of, okay, this is what we understand as cybersecurity. How does this fit into elections? And so there's a number of things that CIS has brought into the community that address a number of different areas, right? Liz mentioned, you know, none of these things sort of are you know, there's a lot of resources out there, and they all sort of address different parts of that community. And so our initial piece here was the Handbook for Election Infrastructure Security, the 88 prioritized security best practices, and that was really focused on, you know, the broad scoping cybersecurity of elections infrastructure, taking what are those common cybersecurity best practices and applying them to elections overall. And we started there. It was a great way to bring to the elections folks a way to assess themselves in terms of how they're securing their environments and addressing against those best practices. And we actually, separate from that, had an assessment tool that we put out there, and a number of states actually took the handbook and they went out and they assessed their locals. And a lot of locals independently went and assessed themselves, and the states assessed themselves against how do I fall within these basic cybersecurity best practices. And that's actually the results that they're using to then take the additional HAVA security funding, take additional funding they're getting from their legislatures and applying it to where they want to commit those funds, right? They're taking those gaps that are identified in those assessments and they're moving forward based on that. And so we're glad we've been able to contribute in that way to provide that sort of insight into where cybersecurity lies. That was then expanded into a couple of different areas. The handbook itself was something that we were able to use to sort of help with the GCA toolkit as well in terms of where to focus those areas of the tools for for the key cybersecurity issues. And so understanding those basic overarching pieces, right? The handbook told you what to do, whereas the toolkit gives you some tools, many of which are well, all of them are freely available, but many of which have been publicly shared in various forums, but putting them in sort of one place that an election official can go to, identify, okay, for this specific issue, how do I address it? Okay, here's this particular tool within that toolkit. And then CISs continue to grow that sort of commitment in that best practice space in two other realms. One is then looking at the procurement space, right? And that can be particularly helpful now as we're looking at a lot of the changes that are ongoing with the pandemic. And as folks are moving to use some of these fundings, there was actually a guidebook for providing guidance on how to address cybersecurity within procurement. You know, certainly government officials are very familiar with how to do procurements generally, but adding that cybersecurity component, what are the questions you want to ask? What are the, providing even draft language that folks can drop right into those procurements to address those cybersecurity issues is one way that we tried to play an additional role. And then lastly, our most recent piece on CIS side has been this guidebook for non-voting systems. And this went more into specific systems, whereas the handbook initially was about internet-connected systems, partially internet-connected systems, and non-connected systems, and how do we address the elections infrastructure as a whole. This guidebook went more specific to those key systems that support elections, not a voting system itself, but trying to fill that gap on how to address cybersecurity in that area. And that's now expanded into a wider role with developing a potential verification framework, RABIT-V, the Rapid Architecture-Based Election Technology Verification, which we've worked with a number of partners at the national, state, federal level, as well as vendors to sort of identify ways that we can be baking security in from the start in a lot of these technology systems. And then as those systems, which we know are bound to have potential vulnerabilities that need to be patched over time, how can we rapidly assess those and get them implemented in a way that they can be addressed fairly quickly? And so that's something that I think has been a way that through collaboration, we've been able to bring more attention to some of these issues and been able to address them in such a short amount of time, really come to a great meeting point of how to address them. So.
Thanks, Ben. Just when you were talking about procurement, it reminded me a couple of years ago, my successor as Kentucky Secretary of State asked me to help out with a procurement of electronic poll books. And, you know, obviously security was a concern when the state was reviewing those purchases. And so we had a couple of technical experts who asked questions that none of the rest of us could really understand. But they knew the right questions to ask. They knew what answers they were looking for. And that was something a few years ago, I'm sure would not have been part of it. A lot of election officials probably would have just accepted the security assurances from the vendors because there was an information gap. And now, you know, with suggestions like this and resources that are out there, you know, states and jurisdictions can make better informed decisions. So thanks. Matt, I'm gonna let you back clean up. Also want to brag, Matt has an Ali book on his bookshelf. He is a native Kentuckian, and I really appreciate that. I'm sure he did that just for me. Yeah, right over your left shoulder. And it's like, you know, it's really Ali, A-L-I, you know, really stands out there. Good job, Matt. So Matt's with DHS and CISA now, and as we've heard earlier, he's worn a lot of different hats. So Matt, you're hitting cleanup. Tell us, drop some knowledge on us and tell us and wrap us all up in a bow before we move on with the next part of our conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Trey. And I don't even know what books are up there. I'm not in charge of the interior design for the household, but that book's excellent, and I'd highly recommend it for what it's worth. Appreciate it. Appreciate the chance to back cleanup. I think I'm built most like a cleanup hitter out of the four of us on this panel. So I'll do my best to close this part of the conversation out. Really appreciate the Global Cyber Alliance inviting me and allowing me to participate on behalf of CISA. The question about where are we, how did we get here is a really good one, a somewhat painful one for those of us at CISA and DHS to start off with. We, of course, started in 2016, 2017 with a trust deficit with the election officials. Who are we? What are we doing in this space? Is this a federal takeover? And so the greatest area of progress from our perspective from 2016 to 2020 has been the relationships and partnerships. Ben mentioned working with 2,500 plus local election officials. We're working through the state election directors with over almost 4,000 jurisdictions now, hope to get to 6,000 by November through our Last Mile program, where we're providing basic cybersecurity awareness, basic cyber hygiene, and then tangible checklist steps that local election officials can take to secure their systems, their offices, have incident response plans, the like. And so from our perspective, to go from states really questioning what our role is and even questioning what we're doing to having these relationships, working with all 50 states, working with thousands of local election officials, as well as the private sector. The work we've been able to do in the partnership with voting system manufacturers, voter registration, e-pollbook has been tremendous and has really grown in the last year and a half. And I'm grateful for the work we've been able to do there. From our perspective, as we look at 2020, we're 127 days, right, away. Operationally for election officials, they're already in it. Obviously, they're running primaries, but they're doing so much more. And realistically, ballots go out 45 days in advance in every state, right? And so that's the operational window we look at. So what can we get done in that time frame? Our focus is on a few things. The first is continuing to provide through the ISAC, through groups like Global Cyber Alliance, Brennan Center, anyone else that will, push, be the Pied Piper of this information. What can you do between now and then? Focus often is on voting systems. Understandably, not a lot can be done with voting systems at this point in time. Certainly, things like provisional ballots or backup paper ballots are critical, but you're not going to change out your voting system at this point, nor should you. And so what can you do? Well, there's a lot. The first is providing IT support down to the local level. So we're out working with the jurisdictions, the ISAC's out. Many of the folks that engage through places like Brennan Center or third-party groups are out working with election officials. How do we get IT support to local offices that Trey, all of us have experienced have little to none, right? They don't have the resources, and I don't just mean money. A lot of focus is on that, but just the IT expertise. And so we've seen states get really creative about how to do this, whether it's leveraging National Guard resources or implementing cyber hygiene or cyber navigator programs like in Florida, Iowa, Minnesota, Illinois was the first to do it. How do we get hands-on keyboard support so that if an election administrator is taking advantage of CISA services to do cyber hygiene, they may be alerted that they have critical vulnerabilities, but they don't have the resources to patch those critical vulnerabilities or to upgrade that the system. And so how do we get that support? How do we continue to message that? The second is providing those services that are still scalable and implementable for the election officials from CISA's perspective. The two big ones from our perspective that can be done before November are first signing up for cyber hygiene scans. That's just a scan of your outward facing network, looking for known vulnerabilities. It's not a penetration test. It's not invasive. But what it does is on a weekly basis, provide you a report that says, here's where we identified some critical vulnerabilities. Here are the steps you can take to fix them, particularly around your websites and networks. And so that goes a long way, not just to obviously solving the problems identified, but it creates a conversation between IT support and the election official. It allows them to go show that report and say, what can we do to work together to take care of these problems identified? What else should I be aware of? How can we work together to plan for this? The second is remote penetration testing. So we have a scalable penetration test where no one has to come on site. We don't have to deploy anyone, and we can take aim at your systems and look for vulnerabilities. This is more invasive. It's for some of our more mature customers, larger jurisdictions at the local level in the states, but it allows a real in-depth exploration without having someone in the office interrupting your operations or a team from CISA having to deploy. The final thing I'll highlight is continued work around incident response planning. In the end, all the protections, the work the ISAC has done, the work election officials have done, and it doesn't get talked about enough. Since 2016, election offices across this country have taken so many steps to improve their systems, to implement two-factor authentication and network segmentation and patch systems and upgrade systems. I mean, if you look at just the level of auditability we're going to have in this election versus 2016, we're going to be up over 90%. And that isn't where we were in 2016, right? It's enormous in that ability to audit the election. But you have to continue to look at how do I respond if something happens. And so working with election officials, putting out additional products around planning and exercising to respond if there's an incident. Incidents are going to impact election offices, whether directly through vendors, through other county offices. We see ransomware across the country. Ben could speak to what the EI-ISAC sees on a constant basis around ransomware. So we have to be prepared to detect and recover. And so we're putting a lot of focus in this last 100 days. It doesn't take a great deal of resources or time to implement incident response plans and practice them. And the perfect time to prepare for that is in July. We're hosting our 3rd annual Tabletop the Vote tabletop exercise, where we use state election officials, local election officials, all of the federal partners together. This time it's going to be remotely, working together to say, okay, if this took place, if these scenarios played out, how would all of us respond together and ensure the integrity of the election, message to the public, things like that. So having that preparedness and responding is absolutely critical. There's so much that can be done between now in November to prepare. And I know election officials are working through their checklists. And the last part I'll say, I know it's the focus of the second panel, but a little empathy from all of us in recognition of what election officials are dealing with. This year was going to be hard enough. This year already had cybersecurity at the top of mind, and then we went ahead and threw a pandemic in the midst of this. And not only a pandemic, but a pandemic that asked election officials to not have people come closer together in person, to not meet in communal spaces, which is how we vote largely in America, not recognizing the vote by mail states, obviously. And so election officials are having to do something that isn't what they prepare for and isn't in their nature, which is to respond and implement massive process changes quickly, whether that's expanded in-person voting in advance of the election, implementing large vote centers like we saw Kentucky pull off recently, right? Heck of a job by the election officials in Kentucky, taking a deep breath and all of us recognizing, oh, this is unprecedented for them to deal with, and how can I support instead of nitpick or challenge? And the best way for anyone to do that is to become a poll worker. The reality is we need probably 500,000 poll workers nationwide by November. In-person voting is going to be part of the equation in the vast majority of states. We got to continue to push to have folks volunteer to be poll workers or sign up to be poll workers, as well as making polling places available, state buildings, schools, whatever we can do. So just a little recognition, a little empathy of the challenges election officials are facing. It was going to be a tough year already, and now we have COVID to deal with as well. And so I'll leave it at that and appreciate the opportunity. The final point I'll make is whether it's resources that we've produced around COVID, resources that the ISACs produced or Brennan Center, or the fantastic toolkit that GCA has created, these are all free. These are all available. The biggest change from 2016 outside of the partnerships we've been able to build is the amount of free support and information that election officials have at their fingertips. If you need best practices, you have it. If you need more technical documentation, you have it. If you need checklists, those exist now. So go find them, talk to us. We'll help you identify them. The Brennan or Belfer Center's done a heck of a job on this too. All available to you. So I know I said one last thing and then kept talking, but I appreciate it.
Actually, I think you said one last thing 3 times, but as a fellow Reds and Bengals fan, I'm going to give you.
That's my. Thank you for the grace. Thank you.
Yeah, no, and Natalie, and you're right about that. Natalie book is awesome. Hey, Matt, you mentioned the tabletop exercise. For those who are watching who haven't signed up yet, how would they get involved? Is it too late to do that tabletop exercise?
Absolutely not. Would love to have folks involved. If they reach out to their state election office, whether Secretary of State or state election director, all the information has been passed to the state. Because there's so many local offices, obviously we work through the states to plan this. But if there's a local official that's interested in participating, getting their colleagues involved, many of the states pull their locals in anyway. We literally had thousands of locals on last year. So contact your state election office. You can contact me directly too, and we'll get you signed up.
Okay, awesome, thanks. There was a reference to Belfer, and I know we have some other guidance that we had talked about when we were comparing notes. Anybody want to explain what Belfer's guidance, what is it? How does it not compare? I'm not saying what's better or worse, but like what's in it for those who are curious. I'll just throw that out. So Liz or Ben, why don't you take it? Or whoever was the one that said yeah. I couldn't tell. I was looking.
I got it. It was Matt. I'm happy to do it. We worked have worked and worked very closely with Belfer. Ben and Liz can certainly fill in the gaps. But Belfer Center's done a heck of a job. It started with the work that they did around tabletop exercises and working with states to do tabletops. And then they built from there to create a product called a Battle Step Boot Camp. And the idea is to create operation centers within local and state election offices that not only almost every election office has a call-in center, has a way of taking in information from the polling places, challenges voters are facing, but it's the follow-up and the tracking of trends. How do you take that information and not just create a tick sheet of, the polling place wasn't open or the machine wasn't working, but looking for trends across your jurisdiction and being able to meaningfully respond to the challenges. And so what Belfer's created is both a tool and a guide available at the Belfer Center website that walks you through establishing a meaningful operations center that gives you that ability to really track and respond to problems that are identified either out at the polls or prior to election day. From our perspective, that's the kind of detection capability, particularly if you track throughout the voting period, that would really identify if you have something going on with your voter registration data or challenges with your electronic poll books. A lot of times those will materialize in advance of the election, but you have to be able to spot it. You have to be able to track it, or it's just one-off after one-off. So Belfer's done a heck of a job getting that ready, and really appreciate their partnership and work.
Okay, thanks, Matt. Any other guidance out there that y'all want to make sure that we mention, Ben or Liz? Anything else out there? We've given a lot, so it's okay. I just wanted to make sure we hit on all the good ones. All right. Okay. So let's move. Ben and Liz. Matt hit on some things that he thinks are really important to focus on now, given the time frame. We're nearly July 4th, which means thank God we're almost halfway through 2020. Just because of everything else going on in the world, we'll be all really glad to get done with 2020. What are some things that Liz, put your former elections director hat on, that you could realistically do if you were back running the Commonwealth of Virginia's elections?
So I think, going back to what Matt said, to get the vulnerability scans, right? So you can get and work with DHS and other officials to identify vulnerabilities and prioritize them, and identify the time frame that it'll take to address those vulnerabilities. And that would be one of the quick things that you could absolutely do now. But of course, there's, again, some of the things that we were talking about earlier about, you have your voting system. So now you need to figure out how you can make your voting system more resilient. And much of that is going to have to do with backup paper supplies, whether that's backup paper ballots or backup paper poll books, right? These things are all very easy to take care of and check off between now and November.
Okay, great. Thanks, Liz. And by the way, I saw your humongous smile when Matt mentioned the increase in auditability, like the biggest smile right there. See, that's a smile. That smile right there is what we all saw. I know that makes you and the rest of us feel really good. Ben, Matt also, I wanted to see something up that he talked about, some of the ongoing attacks and things like that. What are you seeing out there? Are you seeing anything different than you might have expected because we're in a pandemic? Or is it just sort of the types of attempts or penetrations or whatever that we would have seen in a normal 2020?
Yeah, sure. I think on the whole, what we've seen so far has been the type of activity we would have expected. Certainly, you mentioned it's normal what we see for a pandemic, and I'll say I haven't lived through a pandemic before, but it's normal for what we see for disasters generally, right? In terms of phishing that uses a theme that's related to COVID versus a hurricane or versus some other activity happening in a particular area, an earthquake or something like that. That is the most common, and cybercrime remains the most common thing that we see affecting these organizations. And so that's something I think that when you look at those threats, that generally what we've been seeing has aligned with what we've normally seen in terms of scanning, in terms of emails, being the primary concern that we've identified. I think the other piece, and Matt mentioned ransomware, and this has been very well trod at this point in terms of that issue, but is the concern about third parties in terms of ransomware and other malware in reality, right? So ransomware's been around for several years now. We're fairly used to it. In some cases, it's sort of become part of everyday life. But the way that it's been these last few months in particular, with the activity that's been observed in the public space, both in the private sector as well as the public sector, but what's out there in the news, has been this risk of, it's not that the entity became compromised, it's that a vendor or some sort of other third party that they utilize support their efforts that had the ransomware, and then the ransomware jumped across the connection, because we have these trusted connections with these organizations that we partner with. And so we need to be looking more closely at those partnerships. What are the security controls around those organizations? Do they match what we as election officials are putting within our organization? And should we, and the answer I think is yes, be applying what we apply to ourselves to our vendors, to our third-party partners as a whole, because those are potential avenues into the organization. As a state, you're worried about, all my locals are connecting into my state systems, right? That's another, all of these are different avenues of third parties. And so it's not just limited to vendors, it's really limited to a whole sort of other agencies, right? DMVs and corrections and things like that, and departments of health that tie in for the death records and things. And so understanding all those connections and how to secure them and how they're a risk point is something that I think is a big area that we want to be looking at as we go into 2020.
Yeah, that's a great point, Ben, the partnerships. And I think with everybody more, working from home, sometimes you let your guard down when you're working at home, at least at first. And so seems like that hasn't been as bad of a risk, but it's just always a risk. And we've got, for our segment, we're coming up to a close. We're not finished yet. We do have some time for some Q&A. And I think Krista is going to read out some questions that the audience has submitted in the chat. So Krista, take it away.
Yes, hi, Trey, thanks. So we do have a few questions that have come in. We had several questions that are asking about, obviously with the increase in absentee ballots and voting from home, what do we see in terms of the potential for fraud there? How are we going to, kind of have a proper accounting of these paper ballots? So I'll pose that to all of the group here to take that question.
I think Liz wants to jump in, but she's on mute.
Sorry, thank you. Yeah, so, I think if you actually look at what is going on with absentee ballots, you will see election officials on both sides of the aisle, Republican and Democrat, vigorously defending the robust election integrity measures that they have in place to ensure that and to prevent fraud in absentee voting. They have signature verification checks in multiple states, sometimes not just on the return ballot, but also on the absentee ballot application itself. So there can be multiple signature verification reviews done before and when the ballot is returned. And then this is, just to reiterate, this is not a partisan issue. I think in Trey, most recently, I think I saw your current Secretary of State say that he might have had concerns about absentee voting originally, but he's a realist. And he in Kentucky promoted the increased use of absentee voting because he doesn't want his voters to have to choose between their life and their health and their vote. And we saw multiple other Republican and Democratic secretaries promote absentee voting as a public health safety measure, including Secretary Raffensperger in Georgia, Secretary Pate in Iowa, and of course, many Democratic secretaries of state, including Secretary Benson and just across the board. So, I think if you, when you actually look at the procedures that election officials are using, you will understand why the potential for fraud is almost nil.
If I could add a couple things just from my experience watching Kentucky over the last couple of weeks. Yeah, Secretary Adams was not a big fan of voting by mail and without an excuse in advance of Election Day. But he said, look, we're in a pandemic. We got to think of things differently. And so he and our Democratic governor worked together along with our state board of elections to come up with a plan. I think there were two things that I saw in addition to some of the things that Liz identified. One was because Kentucky had so few vote by mail ballots historically, making sure that our media and our residents understood that election night was not going to be when results came out. Secretary, after he pivoted from make sure you request your absentee ballot, make sure you request your absentee ballot, and the governor, same thing, both of the messaging every single day, pivoted to it's not election day, it's election week. And we're not going to get results until actually tomorrow is the day we're going to find out results. a lot, and the public, I think, generally accepted that. I think it very easily could have been like, wait a minute, what's going on? Why aren't we seeing the results? Are the shenanigans going on? Or if somebody's leading on election day voting and then they fall behind as absentee ballots come in, that might raise some questions. But if you have an understanding about not to expect the results and the reason why, because the ballots are still coming in, they could come in up until, as long as they're postmarked by election day, they could come in 4 days later. That was particularly helpful. And then the other thing is a couple of the large counties did webcams. It was really boring to watch, but you could see them counting the votes. So if anybody had any questions about what was going on during election week, they could see it. So tomorrow we're going to get our results, and we've been fairly patient. Now we're getting a little antsy this week, but it's a lot better than getting antsy on election night or the day after, or even the day after that. Krista, I think what else you got there for us?
Sorry, had to unmute. A couple of questions have come in terms of how can the private sector and industry support election offices? Are there specific resources or activities that the private sector, whether they're an IT company or in another industry, how would they go about if they wanted to try to support their local election offices? How could they do that?
Matt,
yeah, this is Matt.
See that one? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I'll give a short answer, and then I think Ben actually has something to plug related around this too. But first of all, we've seen the private sector, both election vendor side, ballot printers, folks like that really respond, but also IT companies. So we've seen a number of companies start offering things like free or discounted DDoS protection, email security, working with folks like Google and Microsoft and the advanced protections that they offer. And so election officials, in part, have been inundated both positively and negatively from the private sector saying, hey, we can help you. We've got that solution that can get you there. And election officials, more so than even money, the most valuable resource to them is time. It's what they can't get more of. And, you know, you're 127 days away. They're not going to spend an hour or two on managing new vendor pitches. They're just not. They don't have the time or the energy to do so. And so really, if you're a private sector entity, particularly or if you're out in a community, getting to know your local election official by allowing your company to serve as poll workers or allowing your employees to serve as poll workers or offering to chat or work with them in a productive manner, not pitch them on something that you could sell them, understanding you may have a product to sell is going to be really critical. But we've seen the private sector step up in many communities, engage with their state or local election official to partner. And so understanding for the election officials right now, they're not going to change their systems, but they could use better security around their websites or better email security or alerts that are possible. And then threat intelligence sharing, which is where I'll toss the softball to Ben. But that ability to have timely and actionable information from the private sector, we spend a lot of time working with the EI-ISAC to push either intelligence from the federal sector or doing briefings from the private sector. But anything that gives the election officials more awareness that they can take action on to protect their systems is good.
Ben,
I don't know if it's
Matt,
throwing a softball, Matt, or taking the words out of my mouth.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. Is that threat intelligence piece is very important. If you have information about something that might be useful, that might be able to support the security elections community, you know, the EI-ISAC is the direction to get that to the right folks. If you are at a global or a national level, certainly, you know, reach out to us and we'll be able to have that conversation. Separately from that, if you're looking locally and you are, you know, looking to offer that assistance that Matt indicated, like we said, you know, we're a little too late for, you know, trying to pitch things. And also, you know, our job is not to pitch things for folks. Our job is to get folks to the assistance they need in a reasonable way. And so if you are able to provide some support to some level as to what Matt discussed, you can contact us as well, and we can try to get you in contact with those election officials. We have a lot of partnerships that we've developed over time in terms of cybersecurity companies, in terms of federal partners to pull in a lot of information, but any information that we can get that can be put to those folks would be very useful for us to have. to be able to share that with the wider community. And it would be done in an unattributed way.
Trey, the only other thing I'll say very quickly, not helpful is going out and randomly scanning election networks and systems and issuing a report without ever having talked to them. In all likelihood, you're going to get the wrong websites or infrastructure. We've seen it happen over and over and over again. And you've given the election officials no time to process or even offer you advice on what's happened. So I know it comes from a good place for many of the companies, but that is not the helpful way to engage in the election with the election officials to try to help support. And then also recognizing, for instance, if you're a penetration testing company and you're cold calling an election office asking for full access to their system so you can pen test them, they've built up enough awareness at this point that they're going, this could be anybody, and heck no, I'm not even entertaining this as a suggestion.
Those sound potentially more than just hypothetical situations there, Matt. And I'll just reiterate, poll worker, because that's one of the easiest things that any company can do. We need a bunch of them for this fall and going forward, but especially this fall. Krista, maybe we got time for one more quick Q&A?
Yes, we do have a few minutes left. How do you, and this sort of goes along to the first question that we had with regard to the ballots, but any other specific technology components that you can see really facilitating the elections this year? Obviously, remote voting is a way that technology is going to play a part, but what are there any other realistic high activity, high impact activities, given the short time that we have between now and the elections, where technology could really facilitate that process?
I got a little one again from Kentucky. So Kentucky, normally to apply to vote, you have to fill it out. You have to request an application, fill out the application, send it back, and then you get your ballot. The state board created an online portal that was tied to the voter registration list. So you had to have your name and a little bit of extra information. And one of the behind the scenes things that Kentucky did is they printed up labels with in the correct USPS format with barcodes and sent the labels from Frankfurt to the counties that they could then apply to all the various envelopes that are used in absentee balloting, which made it easier to track those ballots. We did not have a sophisticated ballot tracking system going into this election. We still really don't, because we're not sure that this is more than just a one-time or maybe in November or two-time thing. And so that costs some money and would take some time to make the correct decision. But just that little thing, like having those labels with those codes on them and having it be standardized was really a small thing, but it was a technological thing that that helped. And that also then allowed voters to log on and see, there was a tracking system. Was the ballot sent from the clerk's office to you? When did you apply? When was it sent? Had it been received? Again, for first-time male voters, which is a lot of them, having that comfort was really helpful. So that was that label created tracking, helped in the back end, and also created on the confidence and perception thing. So that was one thing that states could adapt, even those who are not used to doing this. Matt, Liz, Ben, are some other things that maybe think states could consider doing and could do, could reasonably do between now and November?
Well, this is Liz, just to add on to what you were saying. The two things that Trey highlighted that I 100% agree with are the online absentee ballot application tools, which we have seen at least 3 states roll out exceptionally quickly, kind of proving that, yes, you can do this very fast. And there are other states that, based on the time frame that at least Michigan, Kentucky, and it looks like Georgia are going to roll out these tools, will be able to do between now and November. And of course, the ballot tracking tool is also going to be more important this year than ever before.
The phrase exceptionally quickly makes me want to puke in elections. So, taking the necessary precautions, understanding the risk. The only other thing I'll add, and I know we're at the end of time, and this isn't technology in the way that it was referenced, but upgrading unsupported or outdated systems and patching systems, whether you're introducing new technology or upgrading the old, we have vulnerabilities we know are sitting out there. And so just a small investment into some of these systems would go a long way to mitigating what we know is sitting out there as a vulnerability. So that's the only other thing I'd add.
Great. Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Liz. Thanks, Ben. You guys were a great panel. Made my job really easy. Thanks, Krista, for helping us with the Q&A. Megan, back to you.
Thanks, Trey, and thanks to our, excuse me, our panelists, as Trey just said. So we're quickly going to have a couple of quick polling questions to facilitate some conversation in the next panel. And I think the prior panel was a great segue into what we're about to talk about now. So I'll let you all check out the polling questions and we'll carry on in just a moment. And you can actually vote directly on the screen, I understand. So we'll close this question out in just about 10 more seconds here. So as you can see, there are hopefully you can see there is a 60% perception that elections officials and organizations do not feel prepared for 2020. And hopefully the next conversation will facilitate some additional steps that might bring some greater comfort. We'll now turn to the second question in our brief poll. And you can hopefully see the question on your screen, which is, what is the most important election security need? Select one of the following: awareness and training, contingency planning, and we heard a bit more about the upcoming tabletop exercise in July, and finally, addressing disinformation in the public domain, which we also expect to talk about here in a few minutes. So it looks like there's a tremendous amount of concern, not unexpectedly, around addressing disinformation. And I think it's a testament to the conversation in our first panel. There's been a great deal of work and training that's gone on in the past few years, and I think that's the polling results are evident of that progress. So congratulations and thanks to all those who have diligently been working to close the gaps around awareness and training. So we'll have a quick third poll, and then we'll introduce our next panel. So the question is, what can you address between now and the elections, specifically thinking here about elections officials, whether it be, the question is looking like the same. So the thinking here is that contingency planning and preparing for incidents is something that can be addressed. And as I just mentioned, as we've heard, there are several opportunities upcoming for that. So one way also to think about that is by undertaking the hygiene scans that DHS is offering. That also allows folks to understand some existing vulnerabilities that could be closed that could prevent then a potential incident. So thank you for participating in the poll. And again, thanks to our first panelists. We're going to turn now to our second panel, which is graciously moderated by Wayne Williams, the former Secretary of State for Colorado and a current Colorado Springs City Councilman. And thanks to our panelists.
Thank you very much, Megan. And thanks to the first panel for kind of setting the stage, and at least in the view of 60% of the people watching, providing a little bit of less assurance that everything is fine. And hopefully we will solve all of those problems in this last panel here. Let me start. I'm going to give a short little bio on myself and turn it over to each of our colleagues here. And I want to ask as an initial question for you as you give your bio also, based on what you just heard from our other panelists, are there other things you think are important for people to know? And we'll kind of kick it off and go from there. So first, I got started as a Canvas board member back in '87. I later served as an election official in the state's then largest county. And in this beautiful summer weather we're having, we had a forest fire in the midst of the primary election. And so on primary election day, it swept into my city, destroyed hundreds of homes, and I got to run an election in something I had not anticipated happening specifically any more than at the start of 2020 planning that people anticipated COVID. So we have a key part of doing that and preparing and planning. But I want to kind of divide it in two areas, at least for me. And one of those is having the processes in place. And the other is making sure the public feels confident in those processes. And in some ways, they're really two different things. One of those is assuring that people know that what you're doing is going to accomplish things. You've got those protocols in place. And then the other is actually having those. And so I want us to kind of think about both of those aspects because, and this is where I'm blunt. You know, we have 64 election officials in Colorado. Most of them were not chosen based on their communications ability. They were chosen based on the fact they run an office well. And so how do we communicate to folks? And I'll pick on one of those election officials who will remain nameless. They were asked last year, how would you assure people of the other party that the election is secure? And their response was, I don't know. I don't know. And so how do we help election officials give a better answer than I have no idea how to answer the question of how do I provide that? And so David, I'm gonna turn to you first and a little bit of a quick bio for you, and then what your major insights that you want to share are right now.
Sure, Wayne. I appreciate that introduction, and I appreciate the GCA for putting on this event and the wonderful insights provided by the first panel. My name is David Levine. I'm the Election Integrity Advisor for the Alliance for Securing Democracy. We focus on vulnerabilities to democratic institutions and processes, and I specifically focus on elections and the vulnerabilities, particularly as they exist vis-a-vis authoritarian regimes, countries like Russia, China, and Iran. Prior to that, though, I was most recently the Director of Elections for Ada County, Idaho, which includes the city of Boise and its surrounding areas. And I've also been a local election official in Washington, D.C. And in Richmond, Virginia. You know, I think, Wayne, I think this is a sort of an excellent sort of starting off point, and I think a couple of points are worth mentioning. You know, number one, you know, I think it's really important, again, to touch on, like the other panel did, where we have been and where we are. We see an increasing number of jurisdictions that are using paper-based voting systems to conduct elections. We see an increasing number of states and jurisdictions that are using robust audits. Colorado, of course, is sort of leading the pack, and I'll allow the Colorado former officials to talk more about that. But we see an increasing number of places that now are in a position of having something that a voter can verify, and then the ability to validate that after the fact. And that's really important for two reasons, right? One, we could see potentially if there's any nefarious conduct in some respects, and two, we could see if there are any discrepancies and fix that. I think, you know, the other piece, this making sure the public is confident piece, is really important as well, and it's even more important because of the fact that we're conducting elections amid a coronavirus pandemic. And I think one of the things that sort of underscores is the importance of sharing information clearly, proactively, and concisely, right? As soon as you have that information available. I'm under no illusions that, right, there is uncertainty with the coronavirus, right? We've seen folks time and again who are looking for trusted sources with regards to the pandemic. And one of the difficult parts about that is that experts don't always immediately have the answers. And so that period of time between when people have questions and when people have answers is the perfect opportunity, right, for disinformation. It's the perfect opportunity for inaccurate information to be spread, right? And so one of the things I want folks to sort of be mindful of, right, is that you may have questions, right? Election officials in real time are trying to deal with these issues like you and trying to come up with ways to mitigate them. And, you know, I think for election officials, and by the way, not just election officials, but other stakeholders, big tech, civil society, and others, they need to be able, right, when they're coming up with solutions, to be able to make sure that they're sharing them as quickly as possible. And you know, I touched on a couple pieces before, but you know, part of what that's about in this environment is going to be acknowledging upfront how the election process will change and be different than it's been. There are going to be many people that are voting in a different manner than they ever have, right? Wherever you live. And so I think what's really important about that is to be able to talk to folks when you have that information and be able to explain to them, right, whether or not you have the opportunity to vote by mail, whether or not there's an opportunity to vote early, or whether or not maybe you're voting in a polling place on election day that may be different than what it was before. And I'll obviously now leave it to others to sort of help fill in those gaps and answer those questions that you posed, Wayne.
Well, since David referred to Colorado, let me turn to one of our former election officials in Colorado, Jennifer Morell. And Jennifer, if you can add to some of what David just said.
You bet. Well, thank you, Wayne. It's a pleasure to be with you again. As Wayne mentioned, I am a former election official. I spent about 10 years running elections in both Utah and Colorado, and just had this wonderful opportunity towards the end of my time in Colorado to really embrace and think about post-election audits. And so I transitioned from election administrator to election consultant. I'm now a partner in the elections group, where I help other states and jurisdictions with both election administration and auditing. I also am leading the Democracy Fund's election validation project, which is focused on auditing and testing standards to increase trust in elections. So this is all really important conversation, not just around how to run good elections, but how to run good elections in this hyper-partisan and environment, this pandemic, all of the things that we're seeing. And so I'll just touch on like 4 things that I think we need to think about. And I should mention, I'm also a subject matter expert for CISA. So I will talk specifically about some of the products too that Matt mentioned, a lot of those, and Ben, but I want to just mention a few others because I think just sort of reiterating what we heard already, nobody should be running their election this year completely on their own, meaning there are so many people and organizations out there willing and able to help. And so I would just stress, if there is an election official that's watching this and you're facing a challenge that you haven't been able to solve, please reach out, because there is plenty of material and resources and folks that are willing and able to help. So 4 things real quick. Making sure you have a documented plan. And when I say a documented plan, I mean an operations plan, a security plan, and a communications plan. And Wayne kind of touched on that. Identifying vulnerabilities in that plan, providing time to practice and conduct dress rehearsals to look for gaps in that plan, and then really putting a priority and focus on both internal and external communications around that plan. And if I can have just a minute, I'll just sort of delve into a couple of those real quick, or would you rather I wait on the details?
Go ahead, fire away.
Yeah, so when you think about having a documented plan, I think when we think about the time frame, right, and we're talking about now we're down to just a few months. If you don't have that already, let me just mention a couple of things that might help jumpstart your planning. First of all, CISA has their Protect 2020 strategic plan online. That's a great place to start for cybersecurity planning. There was also some recently released resources around COVID-19 in terms of both expanding vote by mail and doing in-person voting. That was done in coordination with the GCC and the SCC. And I won't go through the whole list, but it's everything from ballot drop box to educating voters to electronic ballot delivery, making sure your voter database is accurate, inbound ballot processing, signature verification, and all sorts of things around in-person voting and keeping both voters and poll workers safe. So if you're looking for a way to sort of have some checklists that you could start with to start that documentation, those are excellent resources. And I would be so remiss if I didn't mention the importance in all of that planning in incorporating ballot accounting into your plans and considering ways to do post-election audits. And all of those guidelines that touch on ballot handling include suggestions for incorporating ballot accounting practices into your plan. So that's one. The second is vulnerability, identifying vulnerabilities. Matt did a great job in talking about the vulnerability scanning and remote penetration testing. And I would just say, like, thinking about not just on the cybersecurity side, but even on the operations side, that same mentality of how do I look at my plan and expose vulnerabilities or expose gaps is really critical. And that could be anything from making sure, for example, if you're expanding voting by mail, have you identified the risks and vulnerabilities of the integrity of the voter record? Meaning, are voters going to get the right ballot sent to the right address? So there's lots of opportunities to go through each element of your plan. And then also make sure that there's a backup in place, right? So whether that's a physical backup to the network or the software, or a backup or contingency plan if something goes wrong or a voting location is shut down, poll workers don't show up, those sorts of things. The third, I'll just touch on that practice or dress rehearsal. That's probably the most valuable thing I learned when I was running elections, was running my team through the operations plan to make sure we hadn't missed anything, that there weren't any gaps, that we had documented all the things that we planned to do, as well as the contingency or the backup plans, to make sure we had the required resources, materials, supplies, people, etc. Matt mentioned the tabletop exercise, another excellent way to sort of run through or practice when you're thinking about your security plans. Just final thing, that focus, Wayne, you mentioned it, David, you brought it up, I heard it from the other group. We saw it in the poll. Communication, I think, is going to be the #1 most critical thing going into this election. So thinking about both our internal communication, so how Ben talked a lot about the EI-ISAC and information sharing. How do we share information among our staff, our poll workers, between states and counties, and then that external communication, which I hope we'll get a chance to talk a little bit more about what we election officials can do, voters, and the press. I know that was part of the question, so I'll save my thoughts around that and let Emily go.
Okay. Good lead in. Emily, as a cyber integration director, what are your insights for us, and what thoughts do you have?
So thank you. Both David and Jennifer have covered a lot of really excellent stuff. I have 3 points I'd like to hit on. And the first is, we know that in 2016, voter registration systems, and Liz had talked about a little bit about this earlier on, were a target of particular interest. A tremendous amount has been done to offer cybersecurity guidance and additional resources to states and locals as they really focus in on the cybersecurity problem as a general matter for states. And in order to augment that with a particular set of guidance on voter registration systems, there's another publication also freely available, just like the Election Security Toolkit and the other guidance from the ISAC that MITRE published in December, which is a deep dive on how to secure voter registration systems. So if that remains an area of interest to different localities, that's another resource to consider. You know, let's refresh. Have we done everything we can do about that particular risk zone? The second thing I'd like to echo, and both David and Jennifer have started down this path, is I would say it's one of the most important things that we all can do is to set expectations now amongst the voting population, that this year is different. You don't get your results on election night, and to be as nice and polite as possible, but to say we are dealing with voting zones, voting periods, a prolonged process, and that process is not because something is going wrong. That prolonged process is intentional in order to manage with great integrity throughout each stage of a very different kind of operating environment. so that in the end, we don't, on the day after the November election, we're not facing a backlash from a population who didn't expect that this was going to be a prolonged process and who begins to throw darts and arrows. But instead, I hope many people are saying, this is how it's going to be this year. We knew this was how it's going to be, and it's just part of this process. Let's all just hang tight. It's going to work out, right? And to the extent we can message that, and we can help our election officials message that as broadly as possible to their voting populations, I think we're going to be stronger overall with our outcomes and our perceived integrity of our outcomes. And also, Jennifer, yes, audits. So the third thing I want to mention is in the poll, we saw a sense of real concern about misinformation, disinformation. Sometimes we call it dismiss information. That is something where there was a disconnect between the perceived gravity, the outstanding unsolved problem of managing mis and disinformation, vice what was perceived as being most doable this year. So what we saw as being most doable was that B column, that get ready to really have cyber incident response in place. And so as a third matter, I'd like to offer simply an observation that it may be perceived as not addressable, but there's at least one program which we started called the Squint program in order to provide situational awareness of misinformation moving through social media in specific voting populations to the state and local election officials. So if that is an area of concern, the Squint program, like things that are offered by the EI-ISAC and DHS and others who are really trying to step up, it's freely available and here as a resource for the nation during 2020. So it may be more addressable than people have perceived it to be.
Thanks. We saw in that poll that amongst the attendees here that 45% were really concerned about this disinformation that's out there. And a lot of times it's hard in government to be nimble in communications. I'm aware of governments where any press release, any comment has to go through multiple layers of approval. And that, of course, in an election night issue, just feeds the flame that there are concerns. I remember getting a call that this location was no longer issuing ballots. And what had happened is, yes, the printer was out of paper and they were changing the paper. Yeah. But in that intervening 30 seconds or minute or two that it took, it had snowballed as one person reported this and then it got morphed by somebody else. So how would you advise a local election official to be prepared for this, and what are some tools you would suggest that they could use in this July, August, September timeframe to be ready for the types of things that may come up this fall? And Jennifer?
Yeah, can I go first?
Sure.
Don't wait until the fall. I think one of the things I learned later than I should have actually in administering elections is finding ways to really educate the voters about the whole process of election administration. And that really needs to start early on and helping them understand not just the expectations. Emily, spot on. I think to build up to that is helping them understand how all of the components work together so that they understand, one, it kind of inoculates them, right, against misinformation if they know exactly how ballots are sent out, how ballots are processed, how they're validated, the checks and balances that are in place, all the things that we know as election administrators happen, bipartisan teams, those sorts of things, ballot reconciliation, ballot accounting, chain of custody, testing. The voters and most of our stakeholders don't usually understand. So if we can find ways to sort of educate them early on about that process, and that takes a couple of different, there are a couple of different ways you can do that. CISA has some information flyers that are available to local officials. So those are on the website, both for like results reporting and sort of confident voting. I know there are other organizations providing some of those. I think it's a mixture of information. Anytime you interact with the voter information that goes out to them, using social media, news media, all of those avenues. But I think it's building up those expectations before we get to that deadline. And then, as you said, Wayne, there's that lack of nimbleness. Hopefully we've already educated them enough at that point that we don't have to struggle quite as much to get that message in at the last minute.
Emily?
So I have a couple of thoughts. One thing we have talked a lot about here is we have not done it, but it seems to me that one thing that many jurisdictions can benefit from, and this could be potentially handled at the state level and then offered to all of the jurisdictions to their own services, to their own officials, is to have a set of pre-approved messages for problems that you suspect or can reasonably foresee. So the idea that a jurisdiction is going to run out of paper and that paper is going to have to be reloaded into the printer, I would view that as reasonably foreseeable. So what are the 75 issues that are reasonably foreseeable for which we can have pre-approved messages ready to go at the instant we hear something's happened? And so it's almost like a pre-populated comms toolkit available in sync at multiple jurisdictions. Things will occur that are outside the reasonably foreseeable, but we can triage it, make those things faster because they're exception management, and have all that sort of standard stuff, hopefully in a pre-approved toolkit for all the officials.
Okay. David?
Sure. I think what Jennifer and Emily had to say, I think is really helpful. I'll just add on a couple of small points. I think one piece is to try and, as election officials, right, is to obviously be open, and I think election officials have been, and transparent and inviting of others to take in the processes. I think being able to also provide videos that show how the process would go, right, can be helpful. I know I've done that thing as an election official before, and I know it wouldn't surprise me, right, for example, if Jennifer has done as well. Being able to sort of, and this goes to points that Jennifer made before about, you want to come up with your procedures as to how you're going to run an election. You're going to have contingency procedures in case you need to go to your backups, and then you want to test those things out. And of course, once you have them ironed out, you being able to disseminate that information so that people have a sense for what they're going to see ahead of time is really helpful. And I think that kind of stuff is really helpful because, right, if there are folks, for example, that want to say that there are concerns about forged ballots going on from other countries, you have the ability for folks like Jennifer to be able to go point by point, right, to be able to explain what the checks and balances are in place so that they can understand that such a possibility, right, is remote at best. And so I think it's really, really important, right, to be able to try and make sure that you are taking the time to envision how the election is going to play out, developing those processes and procedures, practicing them, and once you have those finalized, being able to try and disseminate them. I'll add one other thing that's really important as well, which Emily and Jennifer have also touched on indirectly, and you as well, Wayne, which is, as election officials, our ability to touch every single person in our community, right? That's a real challenge. That's a lift. One of the things I think that good civil society organizations could do is to help to reach out to those communities, particularly those that may be susceptible to disinformation or other kinds of inaccurate information. And obviously, those kinds of partnerships can help ensure that those communities might know going into election day, things like, right, the results may take several days in order for them to come out. One of the funny things about this entire thing about election results is election officials know that there's a canvassing process, right, following election night. And so what we're really talking about is the fact that unofficial results used to come out on election night in many cases, but there was a canvass to validate the results. And so, for many election officials, what this is really going to be about is making sure that folks understand that there's a process that could take some time after election day to make sure that the results are right, so that ultimately when those results are certified, people can be confident in them.
I think those are great insights. I want to add just a couple other things, which is each of you have talked about having procedures, having the information. So one of the questions I'd ask as to a local election official is, could I find those on your website? is that information out there in a readily accessible format that kind of walks through the procedures that you do. In the earlier panel, they mentioned observation of the process. So to the extent you as an election official are open and willing to say, hey, here's what's going on, here's the process we're doing, I think that helps to allay some of the suspicions that are there. And then I'd say working with a couple of the key influencers is absolutely critical. So bringing the media in, if you are, in a rural place and your local communicator is a radio talk show host and a newspaper columnist, then have them in, walk them through what you're doing. If you're in a larger media market, TV, radio, or newspapers, but having them be familiar with it and having some answers in advance, like when will election results be available? And to the extent you tell them, hey, we'll have some first results available at 8 o'clock. We'll do another batch at 10 or whatever the case may be. And then the next day we will have additional results based on when ballots come in or whatever the scale is. So setting those expectations with the media. And then the other group of influencers, of course, are the candidates and the parties. Do they feel comfortable in the process? And so bringing them in, inviting them in, making sure they're a part of that, and you answer their questions ahead of time, and you have a way for them to reach you on election day or the next night when they have questions. Because if you don't respond to their question, they're going to post something, and their friends and followers will then take that into as it snowballs across the way. And so we are about at the time that we said we would open it up for questions. And I think we've got some, so let's turn it over to what's our first question here. Krista?
Great. Sorry, let me just pull up I've got several windows going here. Let me just pull it all up. Actually, the first one I think is for you, Emily, and you talked a little bit about the SQUINT program, and I think that's where this question is going toward. How can the state's executive branches, meaning the governors and their cabinet, Homeland Security, et cetera, how can they support the effort monitoring and countering this mis and disinformation campaigns? So maybe you could talk a little bit about how the SQUINT program works through that.
So everybody in the country has come across a sign at one point or another that says, see something, say something. I'm pretty sure by now most people have seen those signs. And that's one of those services that's available to citizens when they see something that's off, but it's in the real world. So if you just take that concept and put the analogy of crowdsourcing, something's going wrong here. These people are saying that Reed School polling place is closed, but Reed School polling place is open. Who am I supposed to tell? If you're a participant in SQUINT, then that information is going directly to, if you report it through SQUINT, it goes directly to the state election director or to their comms person, whoever it is that they have decided is the right person to know when there's misinformation in a jurisdiction. So basically it's crowdsourced situational awareness of misinformation, incorrect information about the operations of an election. It's fairly simple and straightforward. It is not the be all and end all of, we know that this is an enormous problem. Mis and disinformation about, this candidate eats puppies for breakfast. We don't deal with that. But then again, that's not what's in scope for a state or local election official. What they're the experts on is the operations of the elections here. What machinery we have, what are the times and places of opening, what are the particular messages that we have to send in order to set people back to the right jurisdiction for voting. They are the experts on that, and that's what SQUINT covers. It's open. It is also not open to the public. We pre-screen all of the subscribers to make sure that their intention is in alignment with election integrity. So all state, local election officials, of course, fit that. And then there are a set of nonprofits who also participate, who have explicit charters that support election integrity for the nation.
Okay, great, thank you. So our next question is a little bit on a different track. The question is, have we recruited from cyber schools? And one in particular, Cybrary, is referenced, or volunteers as well?
I'm going to guess that that question's directed at me, and I'm not sure that I have a good answer for that, other than there are a number of partners and academic organizations that continue to partner with CISA.
You know, in terms of, I want to actually follow up on the prior question for just a second as well, because we have to view the executive branch as a partner. So when I was Secretary of State, one of the things that we did is briefed the governor's office on different things that might arise, and set up a phone number where we could instantly communicate back and forth if he started to get questions, if his staff started to get questions, so they would make us aware and they would follow up with us directly, as opposed to issuing a press release condemning this without finding out whether it was actually going on. And so I think that's an important part of that election process, is setting that up ahead of time. And then we also began the process of purchasing monitoring information for social media sites, so that we could become aware of things even before someone called it to our attention specifically. But let's go on to our next question.
Sure. This question is asking about, you know, there's a lot of examples of sharing good practices. The question is, could you reflect on bad practice? What should we be avoiding in introducing more technology to elections, given the time that we have before the election and the fact that we're in a pandemic? Any examples you could give on that?
Yeah, I'll take a first crack at that. I think one of the concerns that we have amid the coronavirus epidemic, right, is that folks could make responses to the epidemic that create additional vulnerabilities in the infrastructure. Right, one of the things that CISA put out in coordination with NIST, the Election Assistance Commission, and I'm forgetting, but one other entity, right, was talked about, right, was the high risk that's associated with returning ballots electronically. And quite frankly, while there are some jurisdictions, right, that I think with the best of intentions are looking at that or have gone that direction, right, that creates additional vulnerabilities in the election infrastructure. And so, you know, I think one of the things that I think folks really need to be mindful of, right, is doing that kind of thing, right? Whether or not we're talking about online voting, or, you know, more recently, there was an election that took place just the other day in Poland for its presidential election. They put out, right, deployed a new postal voting system for the first time, right, after, right, having just under a month to put out an election. And so making changes to your election infrastructure in big elections for the first time without having to engage in the kind of practice that Jennifer alluded to is really problematic, and folks ought to be real cautious about doing it.
If I can just add, these are unprecedented times. And so I agree with David. In a perfect world, you wouldn't be introducing new technology or new practices, but that might be unavoidable. There are jurisdictions that just simply, in order to get the job done, are going to have to expand some of that technology. And so I think that's where it's important to recognize the partners and resources that are available, that if you're in that situation, whatever it is, whether you're introducing a new mail ballot sorter, or you do have to rely on some sort of electronic ballot delivery function, that you're reaching out to the experts to help and assist you in testing and vetting and making sure that technology or that process is as secure as possible. And you know, this is focused a lot on cybersecurity, but the physical security risks are real as well. And we've got, you know, jurisdictions again expanding different methods that they vote, expanding vote by mail, combining polling locations, those sorts of things that have a real impact on physical security. Ideally, we wouldn't make such drastic changes running into, months before a presidential election, but simply that's what has to be done to get the job done. And so I think just focusing on all the resources, mitigations, help is what it's going to take to make sure that those are done correctly.
I think one of the worst things that I've seen people do is get very defensive when someone asks a question. Even if it's what you think is a stupid question, you should have an answer for it. And if you attack the person, then you feed into the conspiracy theories. And so, well, isn't it true that this is subjected to fraud? Well, your response should be able to say, here's what we do to prevent that. Here are the steps we take. And so you treat the questions respectfully and openly. And this is, again, one of the challenges that a lot of local election officials don't have a lot of media training. And the correct response is never bury your head in the sand or attack the questioner. It is, here's what we're doing. Thank you for raising that. Let me tell you how we've addressed that question. Let me tell you what we're doing. And if you don't know, it may be, I will get back to you shortly with an answer. I will get back to you within the hour or something else along that line. Let me check and find out, and I will confirm. Or that election place you say is closed, let me get the person in charge of that election center on the phone, and I will find out and get back to you in the next 5 minutes. And I think that part alleviates a lot of the concerns that people have when you show that you're open, you're willing to respond to the issues. I don't know, Emily, if you had anything else you wanted to add here.
I have a thought. I also think that those of us who are in the independent assessor kind of line of work have a responsibility. And I want to just share a brief anecdote. We had a couple of vendors. We run the National Election Security Lab, which does independent technical assessments and risk management in order to try to help states look at cost-effective ways to reduce risk across complex systems. And we had a vendor come to us this year, and this was not the only vendor who did this, but this was most aggressive. And he basically said, look, in collaboration with the smartest people in the world who used to work at name your favorite large tech company, I have created this solution to all possible security problems in electronic voting. And I need your lab to certify me. And certify you for what? As crazy? I mean, we basically said, look, this is not the year to be doing this. If you are very serious about being in this marketplace, what you need to do is go through these tests and remedy all the things that are found, and these tests, and maybe in 4 years, you will have gone through a pilot somewhere on a non-crucial election, and we might be willing to take a look at you. But this isn't even a product line that you should be talking about with jurisdictions. So there are these sort of pre-filtering opportunities where we can maybe help prevent some of the crazy from coming at some of the high-risk stuff from coming at jurisdictions.
I know we've covered a lot of different areas. I should point out for those who are watching that if you click on the handouts, you can download a couple different resources, which both the agenda, but also there's a list of resources that you may want to look at. We want to make sure that you're not having to catch everything in real time, but that you've got the opportunity to go back and actually dive into some of these things with a little more detail. We've provided a number of different resources in passing, but want to make sure that you have the opportunity to follow up on. And for each of you, it may be a different thing that you need to follow up on, but that's why those handouts are there and the resources are there. Let me go back to Krista for the next question.
Sure, and we've got time for one more question. This is actually kind of a compilation because we had a number of attendees ask questions relating to social media. So, in terms of what actions are we doing, can we be doing to improve social media monitoring? Again, this kind of goes back to the mis and disinformation. And curious on your thoughts. Some folks have asked, do you think enough is being done to help mitigate foreign interference in the upcoming US presidential election with regard to social media?
I guess I'll jump in first. There are certainly plenty of resources and time and attention that have been spent by that with the CISA team. So I would encourage anybody that hasn't looked already under the CISA/Protect 2020 to go there. I won't try to rehash all of those, but I think they're invaluable resources in sort of thinking about ways to both mitigate that and confront that. I just wanted to add one thing. Emily mentioned the talking points, and Wayne also mentioned sort of thinking about how to provide FAQs for voters, because I still think this kind of goes to the heart of inoculating voters and the public against misinformation. I think one of the projects that was most meaningful to me in my days of running elections was creating with my team this sort of ballot life cycle infographic that got a lot of traction because it was simple and it was easy for people to look at and understand, this is what happens with my ballot. I think, again, if you look on that sort of Protect 2020 page from CISA, there are a number of sort of areas highlighted there, sort of infographics or talking points that I think any jurisdiction could borrow and utilize to create something similar around their election process, around their own unique sort of policies and rules and guidelines, or creating their own sort of FAQ page, as Wayne mentioned. And I'll add, there's some improvement to be done there. I poked around on a number of state and local websites looking for that exact information, and sometimes it's easier to find than others. But I still think that's really key if we want to be able to counter some of that.
Okay. Megan, do we have time for a couple other responses, or?
Sure, and then we'll wrap up just for the quarter past the hour with some thanks. So.
Very good. David?
Sure. No, I think that Jennifer makes good points. I think there are a couple things that are, I think, worth noting, right? One, I think there should be some real effort put into pre-bunking. That's that sort of affirmative sharing of information. I think we've talked about, and others have talked about, this notion of reacting, and that's obviously important. But being able to share good information affirmatively and often, right? The social science literature has indicated in many respects is as or more helpful in a number of contexts. And so I think, that ought to be getting as much, if not more, attention than, right, playing what in some cases can be the effect of whack-a-mole. I think another thing that's sort of mindful, right, as well is, and this is something that CISA and other election officials are continuously looking to do, but if possible, right, efforts can continue to be made to get that right .gov domain, right, and that HTTPS secure protocol. I know that not everyone has that, but I think that can be really important as well, because when voters are going to visit sites, that can help, right, ensure both that when they're doing transactions on the website, that they feel confident that their information is secure. It's also, of course, gives to them, right, some security or affirmation in knowing that what they're visiting is the actual official, right, election website. And so that avoids them having to, for example, if they were going to a local election office, reaching out subsequently to a state office to get confirmation and then reach back out to the locality.
Let me add just a couple things. One of the things when we talk about inoculating, I worked with a former Democratic Secretary of State. I happen to be a Republican. We wrote a joint op-ed that appeared in the largest paper saying, here's what the processes are, here's why you can trust what we're doing, here's how our election is secure. And I think it's important because there are people who refuse to believe somebody from the other party, regardless of how good their information is. So looking for ways to communicate that fashion bipartisanly, whether it's with a county clerk who happens to be of the other party, or some other step to give people that assurance, because there is that suspicion, particularly in a hyper-partisan age. Emily, any concluding thoughts you wanted to add?
No, really, Jennifer, David, and you just all hit it.
Okay, then Megan, back to you. Thank you, panelists, for your excellent information. And I was concerned because the first group had so much information, but I think we added to that. So thank you for your work today.
Thank you, Wayne, and thanks to all of our panelists, Jennifer, David, and Emily. We'll quickly turn to some of the resources that were mentioned, and as Wayne has mentioned, these are available in the control panel under the handouts slide. Tab. We can also, if you reach out to us at the email address that you'll see a few slides ahead, but not yet, or you can reach out, you can find us on our website. We are happy to email you these resources, but they include references to the information that has been mentioned in the webinar today. Particularly if you go to the CISA website, you'll be able to navigate to some of the Protect 2020 materials, as well as information from the Brennan Center and the Alliance for Securing Democracy, as well as some other resources, including the MITRE voter registration guidance as well. So we'll continue on to the next slide. And there's also the guidance, obviously, from the Election Assistance Commission, as well as the National Association for Secretaries of State. Again, happy to reach out and email you these materials if you'd like. I'll just conclude by saying thanks to everyone for participating today. I want to particularly thank the GCA team, Lisa Light and Krista Montai, who have helped us to pull off today's webinar. And thanks to everyone for participating, particularly our panelists and former secretaries of state. Obviously, you'll see, and you've heard a lot about this afternoon about the Toolkit for Elections. We are very interested in your feedback, good, bad, or otherwise. Please, we would like to make this resource as accessible and as meaningful as possible. So the address for the toolkit is there, and we'll conclude with a call to action, which is obviously to use the tools and resources, share them with your elections officials, and as I just mentioned, please do give us some feedback on the toolkit. We welcome your participation and support, and thanks to everyone for joining us today.